It was supposed to be a way out. Just a break, one little escape to finally clear my head. I'd been drowning for weeks, ever since Rachel and I had broken up. Everything felt thick, murky, like I was trudging through mud. My best friend suggested it. "Go find some air," he'd said. "Get up in the mountains, disconnect for a bit. Maybe that'll help." So I packed a few things and headed out for a weekend alone. I chose a range I'd only heard whispers about. Up near Glacier National Park, along the rugged Rocky Mountains, wild, beautiful, with a stillness that felt like it could swallow you whole. The whole region had a reputation. People would talk about strange sounds echoing off the cliffs, shadows slipping through the trees at dusk, and ancient myths that clung to those mountains like mist. I didn't believe in any of it, but if I'm honest, maybe I wanted to be a little scared. I wanted to feel something that could make me forget her. My car bumped and rattled along a dirt road as I drove deeper into the heart of the park. The trees thickened, wrapping the path in shadow. I parked, laced up my boots, and strapped on my pack. By the time I hit the trail, it was late afternoon, the air sharp and still, like the forest itself was holding its breath. It was supposed to be just me and the mountains. But by late evening, after a solid hike, I came upon a steep cliffside that caught my attention. Rising straight up, its face scarred with narrow ledges, it seemed like it held secrets, as if it had stories buried deep within its rock. And there, about 30 feet up, I spotted something I hadn't expected, an opening, like a dark eye peering out from the cliff face. I don't know why I felt the urge to climb up to it. Maybe it was the allure of finding something hidden, something no one else had touched. I gathered my gear, secured my ropes, and started up. It took longer than I'd thought, and the wind kicked up, slicing through the layers of my jacket. When I finally reached the mouth of the cave, the darkness inside was almost absolute, yawning, like it could swallow the light whole. I paused, catching my breath, trying to shake off a prickling unease crawling up my spine. Standing at the edge of the cave, I called out a hesitant "Hello?" just to see how deep it went, to break the strange silence hanging around me. That's when I heard it, the buzzing. It was faint, like the hum of 100 tiny wings echoing off the stone walls, coming from deep within. I took a step back, chilled, the sound settling over me, growing louder. Before I could react, the buzzing cut off, leaving a silence so deep it was almost deafening. I don't know why, but I called out again, softer this time. "Hello?" Nothing. Not even an echo. Just the black stillness yawning back at me, like it was waiting for something. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just the wind or the echoes playing tricks on my mind. So I took a deep breath, tightened my grip on my flashlight, and stepped into the darkness. The air was thick, stale, and each step seemed to pull me further away from the light spilling in from the entrance. About 50 feet in, I felt a strange pressure, like the cave was alive, like it was somehow aware of me. And then, just when I was about to turn back, I heard it, the slow, deep rhythm of breathing. Not mine, not the kind of sound I could make, but something else entirely. I froze. My instincts screamed at me to run, to turn and leave right then. But my curiosity got the better of me, and I raised my flashlight, shining it ahead. The beam cut through the darkness, and for a moment I saw them, two faces staring back at me. Pale, sickly faces, their eyes wide and hollow, their skin stretched tight over bones. They were emaciated, gaunt, like shadows of people. Their lips parted in silent whispers, mouths moving but making no sound. Their eyes met mine, and I felt a cold wave crash over me, like my heart had forgotten to beat. I stumbled backward, my flashlight slipping from my hands and clattering to the ground. The beam flickered, casting wild shadows across the walls. I fumbled, grabbed it, and turned it off. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold on. The darkness was absolute, pressing in around me, and I could feel their eyes, even in the blackness, watching me, waiting. I spun around, forcing myself to move, to breathe, and I bolted, scrambling for the light at the mouth of the cave. My heart was pounding, every instinct screaming to get out. Just as I reached the edge, just as I thought I was safe, I felt it, a cold, bony hand gripping my ankle, pulling me back, holding me in place. My breath caught, and I could barely think, barely comprehend what was happening. I kicked, thrashed, using every bit of strength I had to break free. And then I heard it, a scream, raw and guttural, tearing through the silence. It wasn't human, it was something else, something feral, ancient. That sound, whatever it was, filled the cave, echoing through the stone, until I felt like it would split me open. I finally broke free, lunging toward the light and scrambling up the cliff, my hands clawing at the rock, every inch of me focused on escape. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I climbed faster than I'd ever thought possible, my hands slipping, my heart thundering, and I didn't stop until I was back on the trail, gasping, shaking, feeling the adrenaline surging through me. When I was far enough away, I turned and looked back. The cliffside loomed in the fading light, silent and still. But I could feel it, even from a distance. Whatever was in that cave was still there, still watching, still waiting. In a daze, I took out a knife and scratched an X into the rock at the bottom of the cliff. It was crude, but I hoped it would be enough to warn anyone else who came close. Then I stumbled back to my car, my mind reeling, my skin crawling. I called the rangers, left a message, gave them the coordinates. I told them I'd found something dangerous, something unnatural. On the drive back, the image of those faces kept replaying in my mind. The hollow eyes, the too tight skin, the silent whispers. I wanted to shake it off, to convince myself that it hadn't been real. But every time I closed my eyes, they were there, staring back at me. I don't know what I saw, don't know what those things were. But I know I'll never forget them. And sometimes, when it's quiet, when the world goes still and dark, I can still feel that bony hand wrapping around my ankle, pulling me back into the shadows. It was supposed to be an escape. But whatever that place was, whatever was in that cave, it followed me out. I'll share the story as though it happened to me, a night I'll never forget. It was one of those long, shadow-draped drives that stretch out infinitely, where the only sounds are the hum of tires on asphalt and the quiet static on the radio. I had been working late, and the clock on my dashboard glowed a dreary 2:14 a.m. as I made my way down the empty road. The interstate was silent, almost eerie. The gas stations were closed, and I was nearly alone, save for the occasional pair of headlights that passed me by like fleeting ghosts. Trees towered on either side, tall and dark, bending over the road like they were trying to shield it from the night sky. There was a strange chill in the air, even though it was early fall. As I gripped the steering wheel, I kept my eyes ahead, trying to ignore that crawling feeling at the back of my neck, the way the shadows seemed deeper than usual. That's when I saw him. A lone figure, illuminated by my headlights, stood on the shoulder, his arm outstretched in that universal sign for a lift. He was tall, wearing a dark coat that looked too thin for the temperature. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could make out the glint of his eyes as he turned toward my car. It struck me as odd. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this hour? But before I could talk myself out of it, my hand was already on the wheel, slowing my car to a crawl until I finally came to a stop a few feet ahead of him. I rolled down my window just a bit, only enough for a short exchange. "Need a ride?" I asked, trying to keep my tone steady. He stepped closer, and as he did, I could make out a faint smile beneath the shadow cast by his dark hood. "Thank you. I just need to get to the next town." His voice was low, calm, but there was something about it that didn't sit right with me, an odd cadence, maybe. But it was late, and I could imagine that I would appreciate the same gesture if I were in his shoes. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the passenger door, and he slipped inside without another word. The stranger settled into the seat, folding his hands in his lap, and for a few minutes, we drove in silence. It was uncomfortable, the kind of silence that sits heavy in the air. I tried to break it with some small talk, asking where he was from, why he was out here so late. His answers were short, almost too vague. "Just traveling," he'd say, staring straight ahead. "What about you?" he asked suddenly, turning his head toward me. I could feel his gaze, almost like a weight pressing down on me. I swallowed, my grip tightening on the wheel. "Oh, I just had a long shift at work," I replied, keeping my eyes glued to the road. He nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible smile on his lips. "Long night, huh? Yeah, you could say that." I forced a laugh, hoping to shake off the unease. As we continued down the empty road, his questions grew a little stranger, more intrusive. He started asking about my family, whether I lived alone, whether anyone was expecting me at home. I kept my answers as vague as possible, but every time I tried to steer the conversation back toward him, he deflected it expertly, always guiding it back to me. It was then that I noticed him fingering something in his coat pocket. My heart skipped a beat. I could see the outline of something metallic, glinting briefly as he adjusted his position. I felt a sudden, instinctual need to get away, to stop the car and get out. But how? We were still miles from the nearest town, and there wasn't another soul in sight. "Do you like the quiet?" he asked, breaking the silence with a suddenness that startled me. "What do you mean?" I replied, hoping my voice didn't betray my nerves. "The quiet of the night," he murmured, almost to himself. "There's something peaceful about it, don't you think? Out here, where no one can hear you." I forced myself to laugh, though it came out strangled. "I guess I never really thought about it." He turned to look at me then, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You should. It's a special kind of quiet out here." His fingers brushed whatever he held in his pocket, and I could see now that it was a small, thin blade, a knife, glinting ominously under the dim lights of the dashboard. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to do something, to get away, but I kept my expression calm, trying not to let him see my fear. Then I had an idea. "Hey, I'm running low on gas," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "There should be a station coming up soon. I just need to pull over." He didn't say anything, just nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears as I drove on, scanning the roadside for any sign of life. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the dim lights of an all-night gas station up ahead. I pulled in, my eyes darting around for anyone, another car, a person, anything that could help. But the station was deserted, save for a single clerk standing behind the counter inside. I got out of the car, forcing a casual expression as I told my passenger, "Just going to fill up real quick." As soon as I was out of his sight, I rushed inside, practically stumbling through the door. The clerk looked up, surprised by my disheveled appearance. "Everything all right?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "Listen," I whispered urgently, leaning over the counter. "There's a guy in my car, he's got a knife, and I think he's dangerous. Can you call the police?" The clerk's face went pale, and he nodded, reaching for the phone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting the stranger to appear in the doorway any second. My heart pounded, each second stretching out into eternity. Then I heard it, a car engine revving. I turned around, just in time to see my car pulling away, disappearing into the night with the stranger behind the wheel. He was gone, leaving nothing but a trail of dust and a lingering sense of dread. When the police finally arrived, they took my statement, though I could tell from their expressions that they thought it was just some hitchhiker gone wrong. They tried to reassure me, but there was no hiding the horror that lingered in the pit of my stomach. The thought that I'd let him into my car, that I'd been inches away from whatever he'd planned to do with that knife, haunted me long after that night. To this day, I still don't know who he was or what he wanted, but sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I think about him. The way he talked about the quiet of the night, the dark places where no one could hear you. And every so often, I catch myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him sitting there in the back seat, watching, waiting. I've never picked up another hitchhiker. I don't think I ever will. I'll start by saying my uncle's been an adventurer his entire life, a real adrenaline junkie. I mean, growing up, I would hear stories about him climbing mountains, diving off cliffs, and trekking through forests alone like it was nothing. But Everest, that was something different. It changed him in ways I never thought possible. He didn't come back the same person. When he first told the family about his plans to conquer Everest, everyone was excited for him, supportive even, despite the risks. But there was something off about the way he spoke that time. He wasn't his usual loud, joking self. He was quieter, almost contemplative. Looking back, I think he knew, on some level, that Everest wasn't just another mountain. But he was determined, and he left with a promise that he'd return safe. For weeks, we got updates on his journey through quick calls or emails. He would share how it was beautiful and exhilarating, how the landscape was otherworldly. But as he reached higher altitudes, the messages became shorter, more strained. He'd mention how brutal the climb was and how he was feeling the altitude getting to his head. But it was just part of the journey, or so he claimed. Then, one message stood out. It was just 3 words. Going alone now. When I finally got to hear the story from him in person, his hands were trembling as he recounted it. He'd reached the death zone, that terrifying stretch above 8,000 meters where the oxygen's so thin, the body starts to shut down. He'd made it to that point but knew he was moving slower, feeling the full weight of the lack of air, and then he saw someone, lying just off the trail. My uncle described the figure as a man, dressed in worn, heavy winter gear, partially buried in the snow. He looked too recent to be one of the many bodies that Everest has claimed over the years, but the man was eerily still. My uncle was no stranger to the stories about Everest casualties. He knew well that the dead often remain there, frozen forever on the mountain. But seeing this up close, it was something else entirely. He felt a chill, something that pierced right through the altitude gear and his heavy clothes. It was then that he heard it, a voice, faint, drifting through the thin, icy air. He swore it was the dead man's voice, or at least that's what his mind told him at that moment. He tried to shake it off, attributing it to exhaustion, but as he moved away, the voice seemed to follow him, growing louder in his head. At that point, he knew he had to turn back. The summit was no longer worth the risk, he decided. Just as he was about to start his descent, he felt someone's presence, a person approaching him from behind. He whipped around, and there was a man, smiling, with eyes that seemed almost too bright, almost feverish. This stranger was wearing a yellow jacket, scuffed but functional, and had a look of intense, almost unnatural energy in his gaze. "You're almost there," the man shouted, his voice carrying far too easily in the thin air. "Don't quit now. The summit is right there, waiting for you." My uncle didn't say a word, just nodded numbly. Something felt so wrong about the man, but at the same time, the stranger's enthusiasm was contagious. So my uncle hesitated. The man's words sparked a familiar longing in him, that urge to keep going, to not give up. He started moving forward again, but that was when the exhaustion truly set in. The high altitude was sapping his energy, and with each step, he felt weaker. The voice came again, stronger this time, urging him to push on. He stopped, turned back to tell the stranger that he couldn't do it, that he was done, but the man wasn't there. He scanned the ridges and snow around him, looking for footprints, for any trace of someone else having been there, but there was nothing, just empty, endless whiteness. And then there it was, the man's face, now just a few feet away, smiling wider, his eyes now hollow, almost glowing against the icy landscape. He didn't make a sound, but my uncle felt his silent laughter ripple through the air. That's when the man spoke again. "Don't you want to see the summit? Don't you want to make it?" My uncle could only nod, completely transfixed. He tried to walk away again, but the stranger's laughter seemed to echo in his mind, louder and louder, almost piercing. In a desperate moment of clarity, he managed to turn back, muttering a soft "no" to the man. And just like that, the stranger's smile dropped, replaced with an expression of pure disappointment. He sighed, shrugged, and said, "Well, suit yourself. But watch me." And then, without hesitation, the man stepped off the edge. My uncle stumbled forward, peering down into the abyss, searching for any sign of the stranger, any movement in the snow below, a splash of yellow against the white. there was nothing. No trace of the fall, no footprints leading to the edge. It was as if the man had vanished, dissolved into the mountain itself. Shaken and filled with a primal, gut-wrenching fear, my uncle turned and began his descent, barely aware of his own body, just willing himself to get down, to get away. At some point, he collapsed, the lack of oxygen and the pure terror overwhelming him. When he woke up, he was in the base camp's medical tent. A group of climbers had found him lying just below the death zone and brought him back down. He was alive, but something inside him had changed, something that couldn't be explained by just exhaustion or altitude sickness. After he returned to the US, he couldn't let go of what he'd seen, or rather, who he'd seen. Driven by a need for answers, he started researching, looking up information on recent casualties on Everest, trying to convince himself that he'd just encountered a lost climber's ghost, that it was all a hallucination. But then, he found something that froze his blood. He came across an article about a man who had perished on Everest just days before my uncle's climb. The photo was unmistakable. It was the man in the yellow jacket, the one who had taunted him to keep climbing, who had laughed, who had stepped off the cliff without a second thought. Since then, my uncle's never been the same. He won't talk about Everest without a haunted look in his eyes, a look that says he's still seeing that smiling face, still hearing that laughter echo through the cold, thin air. It's as if a part of him never came down from that mountain, left behind with the lost souls who haunt those slopes, forever waiting for someone else to take the same fatal step. My wife, Lisa, and I got married in 2017 at St. Andrew's Chapel, a beautiful old church tucked away in the quiet, leafy neighborhood of Magnolia Grove, Florida. It was Lisa's dream to have a wedding here, with its towering stone walls, its intricate stained glass, and that hauntingly beautiful garden behind the church where we'd planned to take our photos. Everything was perfect, at least that's how it started. Lisa has this cousin, Kara. Kara had a bit of a troubled past, to put it lightly. She'd been battling addiction for years, and though she'd distanced herself from the family in the past, she'd recently made an effort to reconnect. It was Lisa's idea to invite her, and I couldn't really object. After all, it was family. Kara arrived with a boyfriend named Tim, who I hadn't heard much about before. Tim didn't look like he belonged at a wedding. He had this sneering grin, an intense stare, and a look in his eyes that suggested he wasn't here to celebrate anything, but to judge. He wore a wrinkled black shirt, a little too tight, and his hand clutched a small, scratched-up leather bag that he refused to put down. After the ceremony, we all gathered in the garden behind the church. It was a peaceful place, just the faint sound of traffic from the street nearby, and the scent of flowers and fresh-cut grass in the air. But the calm didn't last. Kara and Tim were off to the side, whispering among themselves. I could feel their eyes on us, on the guests, scanning over everyone with an intensity that was almost predatory. At one point, Tim caught my gaze and smirked, a mocking, unsettling expression that left me on edge. Eventually, we made our way to the reception hall, a quaint little place with low wooden beams and flickering lights. The guests were laughing, drinking, celebrating. It was exactly what I'd pictured, a scene out of a dream. But my dream turned into a nightmare when Tim found me in the corner of the room, away from everyone else. He started asking me questions, odd questions. He asked about my work, my family, and the house Lisa and I had just moved into. His tone was casual but laced with something else, something sharp, like he was probing for weaknesses. I tried to brush him off politely, but he didn't take the hint. He leaned in close, a little too close, and muttered, "You think you know Lisa? You think you know her family?" He let out a harsh laugh, leaving me with a creeping feeling of unease. Then, without another word, he disappeared. It wasn't until later in the evening, when one of our friends tried to place a gift in the back room, that we noticed something was wrong. The door was ajar, and a few of the gifts were missing. It wasn't much, just a few smaller items, a gift card here, a small wrapped box there, but it was enough to raise suspicions. Lisa's family was already talking about calling the police, murmuring that Tim must have been the culprit. But there was nothing concrete, just a gut feeling, that sense of violation that hung in the air like a heavy fog. After the party, we finally got back to our new house. Lisa was exhausted, and we were both too tired to talk much. But just as we were settling in, her phone buzzed with a new text message. It was from Kara's number. "Need your address to drop off the gift Tim forgot to give you," the message read. But the way it was phrased, the punctuation, or a lack of it, didn't seem like Kara. Something about it felt off, wrong. Lisa decided to call Kara's number instead of replying to the text. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, then someone picked up, but no one spoke. Lisa tried again, asking, "Kara? Is that you?" But the only response was silence, followed by the faint sound of someone breathing, slow and deliberate. Lisa ended the call, her face pale. She tried calling Kara's grandmother, who confirmed that Kara was already home and that she'd left her phone at the reception. That's when it hit us. Tim had Kara's phone. And now he had our address. That night we didn't sleep. Lisa's dad stayed over, insisting he'd keep an eye on the house. I kept checking the locks, the windows, and the shadows outside. Every noise seemed louder, every creak sharper, every shadow darker. In the early hours of the morning, I got a text from Lisa's dad, who was in the living room. It was a single line. "Someone is outside the windows." I rushed to the living room, heart pounding. My father-in-law stood there, clutching his phone, pointing at the window, his face drawn and pale. We watched, breath held, as a figure outside slowly moved from window to window, crouching low, trying to peer inside. It was hard to make out in the darkness, but I was sure it was him, Tim. We called the police, and by the time they arrived, the figure had vanished into the night. They did a sweep of the area, but there was nothing to find, no footprints, no broken branches, no evidence that anyone had even been there. But Lisa and I knew what we saw. The next morning, I called Kara, asking about Tim, trying to get some answers. She was evasive, defensive. She mentioned they'd had an argument and accused us of turning everyone against him. She claimed he'd stormed off after the reception and hadn't returned her calls. We never saw Tim again after that, and I hope we never will. He vanished as suddenly as he'd appeared, leaving behind a sense of unease that settled over us like a heavy, unshakable shadow. To this day, I don't know what his intentions were. Lisa and I decided to keep our distance from Kara after that. We didn't blame her, not really, but we couldn't risk letting someone like Tim into our lives again. We moved away from that house a year later, but the memories stayed with us. It was a quiet Tuesday in October, cool, crisp, and surprisingly clear for the season. I was walking home after a late shift at the bookstore. The streets were empty, bathed in an eerie, pale light from the street lamps, and a dense fog clung to the ground, softening the hard edges of the buildings around me. Usually, I loved the walk home. It gave me time to unwind and decompress from the day. But that night, something was different. At first, I barely noticed him. I was maybe 2 blocks from my apartment, my footsteps echoing softly in the stillness, when I became aware of another sound, footsteps behind me, falling just a half-beat slower than mine. I glanced back quickly, casually, not wanting to make it obvious. There was a man there, just far enough back that I couldn't make out his features in the dim light. He wore a dark hoodie pulled up over his head, and his hands were tucked into his pockets. I brushed it off at first. There were plenty of late-night walkers in the neighborhood. Maybe he was just on his way home, like me. I quickened my pace a little, but the footsteps behind me adjusted, keeping that steady distance. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence. My imagination was overreacting, fed by the fog and the deserted streets. I turned a corner, and he turned too. I took a sudden left at the next crosswalk, and still, he followed. A slight unease was beginning to creep in, but I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I tried a more subtle test. I slowed down, making my footsteps softer, and listened. The footsteps behind me slowed, too. Okay. This wasn't normal. The realization hit me in a wave of ice-cold dread that rolled down my spine. He was copying my pace, matching every little change. I looked back over my shoulder again, trying to get a better look at him, but he stopped in his tracks, just barely in the shadow of a nearby lamppost, his face obscured. His stance was relaxed, casual, too casual. He was watching me, I could feel it, and I swear, I caught a glimmer of his eyes reflecting the dim light. Or maybe I just imagined it. I turned forward again, my heart pounding now. There was a small park a couple of blocks down, with a few benches and a playground. Maybe, if I sat down and acted like I was resting, he'd just keep walking past me. I tried to act natural, like I was just on my way, enjoying the night air. I took my phone out and pretended to text someone, hoping he'd think I was checking in with a friend. As I got closer to the park, I felt a strange urge to run, but I resisted it. Running would show him I was afraid that I'd noticed him. So I forced myself to walk, even as I heard his footsteps following me, always a few paces back, always with that same rhythm. Finally, I reached the park and sat down on a bench, putting my phone to my ear as if I were on a call. The bench creaked under me, breaking the heavy silence. I waited, breathing slowly, my hand gripping the phone tightly as I listened, hoping he would just keep walking. But he didn't. Instead, he stopped just a few yards away, standing still on the sidewalk, watching me. I tried not to look directly at him, but I could feel his eyes on me. My heart was thundering so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I glanced down at my phone, trying to think of what to do next. I could call someone, but who would I even call at this hour? Forcing myself to stay calm, I stood up slowly, slipping my phone back into my pocket. I took a few steps forward, as if I were heading toward the street again, hoping he'd take the hint and go on his way. But he didn't. He just started walking again, following me, keeping that same unnervingly steady pace. I veered left, taking a side street that would take me out of my way but might shake him off. The street was narrower here, the fog thicker, swallowing the streetlights and casting strange, elongated shadows. I could see my own shadow stretching out in front of me, long and distorted, and behind it, another shadow. His shadow. I quickened my pace, my pulse racing now. I could hear him behind me, following me, just as steady as before. I was beginning to panic. My mind raced through every horror story I'd ever heard, every urban legend about strangers in the night. My hands were shaking as I turned another corner, barely thinking, just trying to put as much distance between us as possible. But every time I thought I'd lost him, I'd hear those footsteps again, closer now, almost as if he were gaining on me. I couldn't bear it any longer. I turned around, desperate, ready to confront him, to tell him to leave me alone. But he was just standing there, close enough that I could finally see his face, or at least part of it. His hood still cast a shadow over his eyes, but his mouth was visible. He was smiling, a slow, wide grin that stretched too far, almost unnatural. His teeth were starkly white in the dim light, and something about that smile made my blood run cold. It was as if he knew something terrible, and he was just waiting for me to realize it, too. I took a step back, my voice caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to shout at him, but the words wouldn't come. I turned and ran, finally abandoning all pretense of calm. I sprinted down the street, not caring if I made noise, not caring who saw. I just wanted to get away from that horrible smile, that chilling gaze. But no matter how fast I ran, he was there, somehow always a few steps behind me. I could hear his footsteps, echoing in the empty streets, never breaking rhythm, never faltering. I felt like I was trapped in some nightmare where no matter how far you go, you can't escape. My apartment building was in sight now, and I felt a spark of hope. I reached into my bag for my keys, clutching them tightly as I raced up the steps to the front door. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in. Finally, the lock clicked, and I burst inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I leaned against the door, panting, my entire body shaking with fear. But it wasn't over. Through the peephole, I could see him standing outside, just staring at my door. He didn't knock, didn't try to get in. He just stood there, that horrible smile still fixed on his face, like he was enjoying this, enjoying my fear. After what felt like hours, he finally turned and walked away, disappearing into the fog. I didn't move from the door for a long time, barely daring to breathe, half expecting him to come back, to knock, to try and get in. The next day, I called the police. I told them everything, how he'd followed me, how he'd waited outside my door, how he just disappeared into the fog. They listened, nodding, taking notes, but there was nothing they could do. No evidence, no witnesses, just my story. Since that night, I haven't been the same. I've started taking different routes home, avoiding that part of town. That October in 2017, we thought we were in for just another adventure. Just me, Ron, Marcus, and Eliza, setting out to hike and camp in the Adirondacks. We'd all known each other since college, and over the years, we'd built a tradition of fall camping. The season held a strange beauty in that part of New York, intense, with colors fading into darkening skies as if the entire landscape were preparing to slip into some deep slumber. We drove out to the Adirondacks on a Friday, arriving at the trailhead around noon. We spent the day hiking up, and as we gained altitude, the air grew sharper, cooler. Shadows lengthened, and the sun fell lower as the trees gave way to exposed rocky outcrops. By late afternoon, we found a flat, solid rock surface where we decided to set up camp. It was a stark, isolated spot with sweeping views of the forest below. The only sounds were the wind threading through the trees and our own voices as we set up. Night fell quickly. We built a fire, its flickering warmth a welcome comfort as we huddled around to eat and swap stories. There was this eerie silence surrounding us, broken only by the crackling flames. It's funny, sometimes you can feel something wrong in the air, a heaviness that you can't quite place, like the forest itself is watching. Then we heard it, a scream. A woman's scream. It pierced the night, carrying through the forest from somewhere in the distance. We all froze, our eyes locking in shared shock. The sound wasn't close but seemed to be coming from further up the trail. There was a strangeness to it, a raw desperation that set every nerve on edge. We waited, listening, trying to make sense of what we'd heard. But then silence fell again, thick and heavy, as if the forest had closed in around us, swallowing whatever, or whoever, had made that sound. Eliza shivered, drawing her jacket tighter. Did someone get hurt? None of us had an answer. We threw nervous glances into the woods, searching for movement, but there was nothing but darkness. We decided, after some nervous laughs and reassurances, that it was probably just some hiker who'd gotten spooked or, we half-joked, maybe someone playing a prank. But that was short-lived because, moments later, another sound tore through the silence. This time, it was different, like a gunshot but muffled, or an explosion far away, deep in the forest. We all jumped, and I swear my heart raced faster than it ever had. Marcus muttered something about people hunting or maybe rocks falling, but his voice was shaking. We decided to douse the fire. No one wanted to be out in the open anymore. We felt exposed, like there were eyes out there in the shadows, watching. We climbed into our tents quickly, nervously, hoping to just get some sleep and leave in the morning. I was sharing a tent with Ron, while Marcus and Eliza were in the other. We zipped up, lay down, but sleep wouldn't come. I could hear Ron breathing next to me, shallow and quick. My own heart hammered in my chest, my mind racing with questions. What if the scream wasn't just a coincidence? What if someone was in trouble? Then, out of nowhere, we heard it again. The scream. Only this time, it was close. Too close. Right outside our campsite. The sheer, shrill panic in that scream, it's hard to describe, but it was like something ripped through you. Ron grabbed my arm, his grip tight, and we both sat there in the dark, frozen. Then came footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching in the dirt and twigs outside our tent. We could hear them circling around, pacing in slow, measured strides, just outside. My heart pounded as I strained my ears, hoping, no, praying, that it was just Marcus or Eliza, maybe needing something. But when I whispered their names, there was no reply. Silence, followed by another few slow steps. And then, out of nowhere, the tent started to shake violently. Someone, or something, was outside, grabbing the sides and rattling it hard. Ron and I scrambled, barely able to breathe, our hands shaking as we fumbled for something, anything, to defend ourselves with. I felt Ron's hand grip a pocket knife, and I fumbled for the flashlight, clinging to whatever sense of control I could manage. We counted to 3, both of us trying to summon enough courage, and burst out of the tent. We expected, I don't know, some deranged person, an animal, anything. But there was nothing. Just the trees, shadows shifting in the pale moonlight, and a biting cold that seemed to seep straight into my bones. I could hear my own shaky breath as I scanned the campsite, but there was nothing out there. Nothing at all. We didn't waste a second. We ran to Marcus and Eliza's tent, yanked open the flap, and pulled them out, telling them we had to leave, now. They didn't argue. I think the look on our faces told them everything. We started throwing whatever gear we could into our bags, but at some point, we stopped caring about packing. Our tents, sleeping bags, even some of our food, everything was left behind as we grabbed what we could carry and took off down the trail in the dark. The moonlight was barely enough to see by, casting long, twisted shadows across the rocky path. We moved quickly but cautiously, our breaths visible in the cold night air. Every now and then, we'd stop, listening, convinced we were hearing footsteps behind us. But every time we turned to look, there was only silence, and the dark forest staring back at us. We kept walking, stumbling, nearly tripping over rocks and branches as we moved down the mountainside. It was a brutal descent, especially in the dark, but we didn't care. All we knew was that we had to get out of there. The feeling that we were being followed never left us. It was a weight pressing down, a sense of dread that clawed at my mind, making every shadow seem like something far worse than it was. At one point, I turned to look at Marcus, who was walking just behind me. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. And then, just beyond him, in the darkness, I saw something. A figure, tall, indistinct, barely visible in the dim light. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't tell the others. I couldn't. I thought maybe my mind was playing tricks on me, or maybe it was just a shadow, a figment of my fear. But part of me knew that wasn't true. After what felt like an eternity, we finally reached the trailhead, where our car was parked. We piled in, locking the doors, and just sat there for a moment, catching our breaths, staring out at the blackened forest. Then Ron turned the key, and we drove. We didn't stop until we were miles away, pulling over only when we felt safe enough to close our eyes for a few hours. The next morning, we barely talked. When we did, it was only to confirm what each of us had heard, what we had felt, to reassure ourselves that we hadn't imagined it all. But as we recounted the night, one detail stuck with me. When we heard the scream the first time, it sounded distant. But that last scream, the one right outside our tent, well, Eliza swears she saw shadows moving beyond the firelight before we'd even gone into our tents. We searched for answers, tried to find any report of something strange happening in that area. Nothing. No missing persons, no news about any accidents or strange activity in the Adirondacks that weekend. It's as if the whole thing was swallowed by the forest, leaving only the 4 of us with the memory. To this day, I don't know what we heard or what we saw. But that night in the Adirondacks, under the cold October moon, I came face to face with something I still can't explain. It was supposed to be the honeymoon of a lifetime, our chance to disconnect, unwind, and just get lost in paradise together. Hawaii had always been our dream destination, and after the whirlwind of wedding planning, Matt and I couldn't wait to let loose on the beaches of Maui. We were staying at a lovely little beach resort with evening entertainment, fancy cocktails, and everything that screamed romantic getaway. But that day, the day we decided to go on a hike through the rainforest, that's the day I don't think I'll ever forget. It was our 4th day on the island. Up until then, everything had been perfect. We'd spent the mornings snorkeling and afternoons sipping Mai Tais as the sun melted into the horizon. That day, though, Matt suggested we check out a famous hiking trail he'd read about online. It was called the PPY Trail, known for its hidden waterfalls and secluded pools, wrapped in thick, emerald green foliage. "Let's do it," he said, eyes gleaming. And I thought, why not? After all, what's a honeymoon in Hawaii without a bit of adventure? We set out around midday, taking a rented jeep to the trailhead. The sun was high, beating down in shimmering waves of heat, but the dense canopy of the jungle provided shade. Birds sang from the treetops, and the faint sounds of rushing water pulled us deeper into the forest, promising a beautiful, untouched paradise waiting for us at the end. It was everything I'd imagined, until we met the mongoose. Matt noticed it first, a small, wiry creature with beady eyes and a curious face. It popped out from behind a bush, blinked at us, and then darted off into the brush. I thought it was adorable, but before I could say anything, Matt was already trying to follow it. "Come on, it's like a little guide," he laughed, already veering off the main trail. I hesitated, looking around, but then followed him. We were only a few yards off the path, at first. The mongoose moved fast, darting in and out of sight, leading us further and further off the main trail. Before I realized it, the sounds of the birds had faded, and the forest around us grew denser, darker. "Matt, maybe we should go back," I suggested, but he laughed it off, saying, "Don't worry. I think I can hear a waterfall up ahead." A few minutes later, he was right. We stumbled upon a small, hidden oasis, a waterfall cascading into a pristine, jade-green pool. It was breathtaking, like something out of a dream. We were completely alone, deep in the jungle with nothing but the sounds of water and the rustling of leaves. And that's when Matt got a mischievous glint in his eye. He looked at me, then at the pool, and without a word, he started stripping down. "Oh, come on!" he grinned. "When are we ever going to get another chance to swim in a place like this, alone?" I laughed, but his excitement was contagious, and before I knew it, I was right there with him, clothes discarded on the rocks as we waded into the cool, refreshing water. We swam and laughed, letting the water and the solitude wash over us. It was like we were the only two people in the world. But then I felt it. That feeling of being watched. I can't explain it, but my skin prickled, and my laughter caught in my throat. I looked over to Matt, who was floating on his back, eyes closed, completely oblivious. I scanned the trees, the dense thicket beyond the waterfall, and then I saw him. An old man, half hidden behind a tree, watching us. I froze, trying to make sense of it. He had a straw hat pulled low over his face, a long, unkempt beard, and he stood there, half in shadow, just staring. I nudged Matt, and he turned, blinking up at the man. I could see Matt was a little confused too, but instead of reacting, he just waved, as if we'd bumped into a neighbor on a morning walk. But the old man didn't wave back. He didn't even flinch. He just kept staring, his eyes dark and unblinking under the brim of his hat. After a few seconds, Matt called out, "Hey there! Are you lost? Need any help?" His voice echoed around us, but the man didn't respond for the longest time. And then, finally, he spoke. "I'm looking for my dog," he said, voice low and gravelly, each word slow and deliberate. Then he turned and disappeared back into the trees without another word, without so much as a glance back at us. Matt and I exchanged a look, our earlier playfulness gone, replaced with a prickling unease. "Maybe we should head back," I whispered, and Matt nodded, his usual confidence seeming to fade. We dressed quickly, packed up, and tried to retrace our steps. But by then, the jungle felt different. It was no longer the idyllic paradise we'd wandered into hours earlier. The dense trees felt oppressive, the rustling leaves more sinister. After a few minutes of walking, we realized we were lost. Every direction looked the same, and my phone had no signal. Matt tried his GPS, but it kept glitching, showing us moving in circles. To make things worse, the sun was dipping below the horizon, and a damp chill settled over the jungle. The shadows lengthened, and the once gentle sounds of nature now felt ominous, pressing in from all directions. That's when we heard it, a crunch of footsteps behind us. We stopped, holding our breath. The steps paused. And then they started again, a little faster, a little closer. "Maybe it's just an animal," Matt whispered, but even he didn't sound convinced. We quickened our pace, practically stumbling over roots and rocks as we tried to find our way back to the main trail. But no matter how fast we went, the footsteps followed. Eventually, darkness fell completely, and we had no choice but to use the flashlight on Matt's phone. It cut a small path through the trees, but the shadows beyond it were thick, impenetrable. Every so often, Matt would turn the light off, hoping to stay hidden, but that feeling of being watched, it was constant, unwavering. After what felt like an eternity, I dared to look back. My heart nearly stopped. A figure stood in the dark, about 50 feet away, barely visible but unmistakable. It was the old man. The same straw hat, the same long beard, but now, he held something in his hand, a rusty, jagged saw. He wasn't just standing there. He was edging toward us, slow but deliberate. I felt a surge of panic like I'd never felt before. "Run!" I whispered, barely able to breathe. "Run, Matt!" We bolted, tearing through the jungle, barely able to see where we were going. Every branch that slapped my face, every root that tripped me felt like another second closer to him catching up. But we kept going, our breaths ragged, our bodies aching with the effort. After what felt like an eternity, we saw it, a faint glow through the trees. Our car. We sprinted the last few yards, practically throwing ourselves inside. Matt fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he jammed them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and we sped out of there, not daring to look back. We didn't stop until we reached the town, our hearts still racing, our clothes torn and covered in mud. The next morning, we went straight to the police station, but I could tell they didn't really believe us. Maybe they thought we were just a couple of paranoid tourists. They said they'd send someone to check, but I don't know if they ever did. The rest of our honeymoon felt haunted, as if that dark presence had followed us back. Every rustle in the bushes, every shadow on the beach made me jump. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can see him, the old man, standing there in his hat, eyes blank, holding that rusty saw, watching. When I was little, we lived in a small town in Oregon, the kind where everyone knew everyone. Our house was old, a creaky, two-story place with peeling paint and drafty windows that rattled every time the wind blew. My room was at the very end of a long hallway upstairs. It was the kind of house that seemed to hold onto memories, echoing them softly when no one was listening. One night, I had a dream that was unlike any other. I was lying in bed, staring into the shadows stretching out from the corner of my room. But in my dream, those shadows seemed darker, deeper, like they were reaching toward me. I couldn't move, as if something heavy was pressing down on my chest. And then I saw him, a man sitting at the foot of my bed. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his posture slumped as if he was tired or grieving. His face was obscured, smudged with darkness, like it had been blackened or charred. His eyes, though, I could see his eyes. They were hollow, staring right through me, yet somehow filled with an emptiness that chilled me to the bone. I couldn't look away. When I finally woke up, my room was empty, but the fear lingered. I felt cold, like his stare had seeped into my bones. I tried to forget about it, chalk it up to a bad dream. But the memory haunted me. The next day, I mentioned it to my grandma, who had moved in with us after my grandpa passed. She was a tough woman, old-fashioned, the type who didn't believe in nonsense. But when I told her about the man I'd seen in my dream, her face changed. She looked worried. It was subtle, but I'd never seen her look at me like that before. After a long pause, she told me, "Evan, 2 men died in this house, long before we ever moved in." She said it so matter-of-factly, as if she were telling me what day of the week it was. It was one of those cold, endless nights in Omaha, Nebraska. I was doing the graveyard shift at an old, sprawling warehouse on the outskirts of town. Normally, I didn't mind the isolation of my job. The quiet was almost comforting, a stark contrast to the cacophony of life during the day. I was used to the creaks of the building and the faint hum of electronics humming through the endless rows of boxes. But that night, things changed. Our warehouse was massive, filled with high-end technology equipment and components, a lot of it worth a fortune. Because of that, they always scheduled 2 guards at night, one inside and one outside. We weren't just watching out for break-ins. We were supposed to monitor every shadow and every creak to make sure nothing went unnoticed. That night, I was on the inside patrol while my partner, George, was out in the lot, keeping an eye on the perimeter from his car. The clock had just ticked past 1 a.m. I was walking down aisle 27, running a routine check. This section was piled high with various storage crates, and the air felt heavy, somehow stale. As I approached the end of the aisle, something strange caught my eye. Just above one of the boxes, barely peeking out, was what looked like a face. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows. My flashlight wasn't all that powerful, and the faint outline of a head seemed to waver in and out of existence as I shifted my beam. But then, just as I took a step forward, I saw it more clearly, a pale, ghastly shape, almost like a human face, just barely visible in the dimness. It was there, then gone, slipping back behind a stack of crates. I stopped dead in my tracks, trying to steady my breathing. My mind raced, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was a homeless guy who'd somehow slipped in, or some prank. But still, there was this gnawing dread creeping up my spine, something primal warning me that this was wrong. I fumbled with my radio, calling George, who was probably nodding off in the warmth of the car heater outside. "Hey man," I whispered, my voice coming out more anxious than I intended. "I think there's someone inside. Maybe behind aisle 27. George chuckled, not taking me seriously. "You're probably seeing things. It's just the graveyard shift blues, my friend. Check it out, and let me know if you find Casper." I wanted to laugh it off with him, but there was something in the way that face appeared, the unnatural paleness of it. I couldn't shake it. I took a deep breath, mustered up whatever courage I had left, and moved closer to where I thought I'd seen the face. As I neared the end of the aisle, I caught a whiff of something rotten, a smell that made my stomach churn. It was faint but unmistakable, and it grew stronger the closer I got. Whatever it wasn't just a prank. My flashlight beam shook as I aimed it at the boxes, trying to locate the source of the stench. There, in the shadows between the crates, was a large wooden box, different from the standard shipping crates we usually stored. This one was old and splintered, with dark stains seeping into the wood. The smell was coming from there. My mind screamed to turn back, to get George and come back later, but curiosity, and maybe duty, kept me there. I grabbed the edge of the box and, with a deep breath, pried it open. The sight that greeted me will stay with me forever. Inside was a body, or what was left of one, curled up like a discarded puppet. It was missing its head, and the blood, still faintly sticky, coated the interior of the box. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat, and barely managed to turn away before I emptied the contents of my stomach on the cold concrete floor. The horror of it all struck me like a punch. How could this have happened here? And how long had it been here, in the middle of our supposedly secure warehouse? My hands shook as I fumbled with the radio, my voice breaking as I called George, practically yelling for him to get his ass inside. He must have sensed the urgency, because his usual sarcasm was absent, replaced with a tense "On my way." I waited by the box, flashlight trained on it as if the light could somehow keep whatever horror was here at bay. When George finally arrived, the look on his face told me he could smell it too, the putrid rot of death. He took one look at the body and muttered a quiet "Jesus Christ." We both knew what we had to do. George called the cops while I kept my eyes glued to the shadows, convinced that any second now, that face would reappear, slipping out from behind the boxes like some twisted specter. I felt like I was being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling with every creak and echo in the warehouse. When the cops arrived, they took one look at the scene, and their expressions turned grim. They taped off the area, and the forensic team got to work, but the officers seemed as uneasy as we were. After a couple of hours, they found something that sent chills down my spine. The security footage from the previous night had a 3-hour gap, right around the same time George and I had switched shifts. No one could explain it, and it wasn't just a technical glitch. The footage had been deliberately cut. Someone had erased it. As I watched the cops work, the image of that pale, ghostly face kept flashing through my mind. It wasn't just a corpse in a box. Something darker was at play here. I don't believe in the supernatural, but there's a part of me that can't shake the feeling that someone, something, had lured me to that spot, to see what they'd done. The night was still, with only the faint rustling of leaves outside and the occasional creak of the old walls in my house. I had been living in this sleepy little town for about 5 years. It's one of those places where people leave their doors unlocked, trusting everyone around them. Crime was rare, and life moved at a slower, quieter pace. My sister, Ella, and I shared this one-story house. She wasn't around much, spending most of her time traveling for work, so I was used to being alone most nights. My job kept me busy during the day, but running in the evening had become a ritual. It cleared my head after a long day and gave me a sense of calm. I jogged the same route around the neighborhood, past familiar houses and empty streets, before coming home, showering, and settling in for the night. One evening, after finishing my run, I noticed a white pickup truck parked across the street from my house. I thought it was strange because we didn't get many visitors, especially ones that parked overnight. There was something about the truck that made me feel uneasy, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Maybe it was the fact that the truck was completely empty, with no sign of anyone nearby. Its windows were tinted, so I couldn't see inside. After a few minutes of staring at it, I shrugged it off, went inside, locked the door, and settled down. Later that night, I was sitting on the couch, mindlessly scrolling through my phone, when I heard something, a faint noise coming from outside. I paused, straining to listen. It sounded like shuffling, but I convinced myself it was probably a neighbor or maybe even a stray cat. Small towns were filled with odd noises at night. It was nothing to worry about. The next day, I got up, went to work, and didn't think much about the truck. When I came back in the evening, it was gone. A part of me felt relieved, almost as if my mind had been playing tricks on me. That night, I went out with friends for drinks, enjoying the simple comforts of good company and conversation. By the time I got home, it was close to midnight. The street was empty, and a fog was rolling in, making the air feel dense and quiet. As I walked up to my door, I froze. There it was again, the white truck, parked just across the street, exactly where it had been the night before. My heart sank, and I felt an uncomfortable prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I stared at the truck, half expecting someone to step out, but no one did. The lights were off, and it was completely still. Trying to brush off the anxiety gnawing at me, I hurried inside, locked the door, and tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I lay there, listening to the sounds of the house, my heart pounding. And then I heard it. A faint thumping sound. It was rhythmic, as if someone, or something, was knocking on the walls from the inside. My first thought was that it might be pipes settling or some odd noise coming from outside, but the sound grew louder. It wasn't coming from outside at all. It was coming from the walls, from somewhere within the house itself. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and walked toward the source of the noise. The sound seemed to be coming from the crawl space under the house. I hadn't gone down there in ages. It was dark, cramped, and filled with dust and cobwebs. When I reached the crawl space door, I noticed it was ajar, swinging slightly, and the small padlock I kept on it had been broken. My stomach twisted. I felt a cold rush of fear as I shone the flashlight into the crawl space. The beam of light swept across the dirt floor, the wooden beams, and the low ceiling. Everything was quiet, but then I heard it, a soft scraping sound, as if someone was moving down there, shuffling around in the darkness. I leaned in closer, peering into the crawl space, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. They were coming toward me, crunching softly in the dirt below. My heart leapt into my throat, and I slammed the crawl space door shut, bolting back into the house. I called the police, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what had happened. It felt surreal, like something out of a horror movie. I half expected them to tell me I was being paranoid, that it was probably an animal. But when they arrived, they took one look at the broken lock and didn't question me. 2 officers went down into the crawl space, and I waited, pacing in the kitchen, my mind racing. When they finally came back up, their faces were grim. They hadn't found anyone down there, but there were signs someone had been there recently. There were deep scratches in the ceiling of the crawl space, and they found tools, a hammer, a small saw, lying in the dirt. It looked as though someone had been trying to cut through the floorboards, working their way up into the house. I told them about the white truck, how it had appeared 2 nights in a row. They noted down my description, but without a license plate or any other concrete details, there wasn't much they could do. They assured me they'd keep an eye out, told me to be vigilant, and advised me to install a security camera if possible. For the next week, I was on edge. Every night, I'd double-check every lock in the house, jump at every sound. I'd lie awake, listening, half expecting the footsteps to return. The white truck never reappeared, and eventually, life started to settle back into its quiet routine. It was a Saturday night. I'd been hanging out with my buddies Theo and Vince. Now, Theo had always been a bit of a thrill seeker. If there was anything creepy or out of the ordinary, you could bet he'd be the first to drag us there. Vince, on the other hand, was cautious but curious, always looking for an excuse to challenge his fears. And then there was me. I'm the one usually standing somewhere between their extremes, the one who probably should have been wise enough to call it off. So there we were, sitting in my car in a Walgreens parking lot, a few blocks away from this rumored haunted warehouse. Apparently, it used to be an old furniture store, but now it was abandoned, rotting, waiting for someone dumb enough to wander in. According to some locals, strange things happened in there. A few urban legends claimed that people went inside and, well, some never came out. As we sat in the car, the silence got heavier. We didn't talk much. There was a sense of tension, maybe even dread, but no one wanted to admit it. Theo, leaning forward, stared through the windshield, eyes wide and excited. Vince glanced back at the Walgreens lights, hesitation flickering across his face. "Let's just check it out, alright?" Theo finally broke the silence, sounding more like he was convincing himself than us. "Yeah," I muttered, trying to steady my voice. "Let's just get it over with." Vince nodded, though he looked like he wanted to say something else. Instead, we climbed out of the car, pulling our jackets tight against the biting cold. The street was dead quiet as we started walking towards the warehouse. After a couple of blocks, we could finally see it. The building loomed at the end of a deserted street, hunkered down in darkness, broken windows staring out like empty eye sockets. Vines crawled up the walls, and the faint, musty smell of decay seemed to drift toward us even before we got close. Theo's steps slowed a bit, and for the first time, I saw him hesitate. Maybe we should just take a look around outside first," Vince suggested, his voice barely more than a whisper. But Theo shook his head, trying to laugh. "What? Don't chicken out now, Vince. Come on, let's just get in and see what's there." As we approached the building, I could feel a strange prickling on my skin, like something was watching us. The front doors were chained shut, rusted locks sealing them like a tomb. There was no way we were getting in through there. We circled around the side and found a small gap in the wall, a crude hole, barely big enough to squeeze through. It looked recent, like someone had knocked it open just to get inside. "This is our way in," Theo said, grinning. He squeezed through, then Vince, and I reluctantly followed, feeling the rough bricks scrape against my jacket. Inside, the darkness was absolute. I pulled out my flashlight, the thin beam cutting through the gloom. The place was a mess. Broken chairs and tables strewn across the floor, shelves knocked over, debris crunching under our feet. The walls were covered in graffiti, most of it crude and faded, but some of it made my stomach twist. Symbols and strange words were scrawled all over, and amidst the random scribbles, I saw things I didn't want to understand. 666 marked the walls in multiple places, accompanied by upside-down crosses and other symbols that looked satanic. The air was thick and stale, filled with the sour scent of rot and mold, but there was something else, too, a faint metallic smell that hung in the air. As we moved deeper into the warehouse, Vince suddenly stopped, his face pale. He pointed, and I followed his gaze to the stairwell. There, smeared across the steps in dark, dried stains, was blood. A lot of it. It wasn't fresh, but it was still enough to send a shiver down my spine. "Maybe we should just go back," Vince whispered, his voice shaking. Theo, though visibly unnerved, shook his head. "We're already here. Let's at least take a look upstairs." The stairs creaked under our weight, each step echoing through the emptiness. At the top, we found ourselves in a larger room. The air was colder here, and an eerie silence hung around us like a thick fog. In the middle of the room, dangling from a ceiling beam, was a noose. It swayed slightly, as if someone had just let go of it. I stared at it, my heart pounding, and felt an overwhelming urge to turn around and run. But just then, Theo let out a low whistle, drawing our attention to a wall near the corner. There was more graffiti, but this time it wasn't random. The words were deliberate, scratched deep into the wall with something sharp. "Leave now. You're not alone." That was it for me. I grabbed Theo's arm. "We need to go. Now." He looked at me, his face pale. For once, he didn't argue. We turned back toward the stairs, but as we descended, I felt an intense, prickling sensation, as if something was right behind me. I forced myself not to look back, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. Once we got outside, we thought we were in the clear. The cold night air was a relief, like stepping out of a nightmare. We were about to head back to the car when Theo stopped, staring at something behind the main building. It was a smaller warehouse, squat and isolated, almost hidden in the shadows. "Let's check it out," he whispered, his voice almost reverent. No way," Vince protested, but Theo was already moving toward it. Against my better judgment, I followed, Vince close behind. The smaller warehouse was even darker than the first, and as we entered, the flashlight revealed more disturbing scenes. This time, a crude, inverted cross hung from the ceiling, swaying gently in the cold drafts. The walls were marked with holes near the floor, too deep to see into, and I didn't want to know what they were for. Theo moved closer to the cross, his face pale but transfixed, while Vince and I stayed near the entrance. I was about to tell him we should leave when Vince's phone rang, the shrill sound echoing off the walls. He glanced at the screen, his face turning white. "It's Greg," he whispered. Greg had been too freaked out to join us, so he'd stayed back near the car. Vince answered, his hand shaking. "Yeah? Greg, what's wrong?" Greg's voice came through, frantic and scared. "There's someone else here. I saw them. They're watching you guys." My heart skipped a beat, and I looked at Theo, who had gone completely still. "We need to get out," Vince stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Just then, I heard it, a low rumble, followed by the harsh glare of headlights illuminating the warehouse. We turned, squinting into the light, and saw it, a white truck barreling toward us. Panic flooded through me as we scrambled out of the smaller building, stumbling over each other in our haste. But before we could get our bearings, another set of headlights appeared from the opposite side, a black truck, parked and waiting, its engine idling. My heart raced as we bolted down the street, our footsteps echoing like gunshots in the night. I didn't dare look back, too terrified of what might be following us. We sprinted back toward Walgreens, legs burning, lungs heaving, the night air thick with fear. When we finally reached the car, I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. We piled inside, slamming the doors just as the trucks reached the end of the street, their headlights sweeping over us one last time before they turned off, swallowed by the darkness. We drove off in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The images of that night burned into our minds. We never talked about it again, and we sure as hell never went back. Whatever was waiting for us in that warehouse was something we were never meant to find. And every now and then, when the night gets too quiet, I feel that same prickle on the back of my neck, as if something is watching, waiting for us to return. And I know, deep down, that we were lucky to leave at all. I remember it like it was yesterday. The summer of 2017. My family owns a modest little cabin tucked away in a dense stretch of forest in Colorado's Arapahoe National Forest, a good 7-hour drive from where I live. It's a spot we use for hunting and getting away from it all, a place to detox from the world. I've probably been there about 40 times throughout my life, but since that night, I can't bring myself to go back alone. This is what happened. It started as any other solo trip, a weekend set aside to hunt and clear my mind. I pulled my truck off the old dirt road, tires crunching over dry grass as I parked by the cabin. There's no driveway, really. We park wherever we want on the grass in front of the deck. The place is simple, but it's ours, a little slice of peace surrounded by trees as far as the eye can see. I let myself in using the keypad. We don't use keys up here, for fear of losing or forgetting them. Once inside, I switched on the electricity and started up the water heater since no one had been there in weeks. It was around noon, and I had the cabin to myself. I ate the lunch I'd brought, tossed out the old mouse traps from around the house, it's got a real pest problem, especially in the summer, and started organizing my gear for hunting the next day. By 6 o'clock, the sun was just beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long, stretched shadows across the lawn. That's when I heard it. A sound I wasn't expecting in a place like this, laughter. It drifted from somewhere in the woods, light and carefree, like a group of kids playing tag. It caught me off guard. I was out here in the middle of nowhere. No neighbors, no campsites nearby. It had to be kids though. But how? They'd have to be deep in the woods to wander all the way to our property. I walked over to the window in the living room that faced the forest. It was quiet. Almost too quiet, but still, no one was in sight. I cranked the window open and listened, trying to catch the sound again. After a moment, the laughter picked up once more, fading in and out as though the kids were moving around. I figured they were playing some game, maybe hide and seek. But it made me uneasy. It was our property, after all, and no one was supposed to be out here. So I grabbed my flashlight and headed out the back door, thinking I'd scare them off. Maybe tell them they were trespassing. I ventured a few yards into the woods, calling out as I went. Hello? Anybody out here? No answer, just the sound of laughter, getting softer, fainter, as if the kids were retreating. But no matter how far I walked, it felt like I couldn't get any closer to them. Frustrated and slightly on edge, I eventually turned back, thinking they'd run off and that would be the end of it. The next day, I woke up early and headed out to the hunting tower my dad and I had built years ago. It's a small wooden lookout post, perfect for spotting deer. I was up there for a few hours, scanning the forest, waiting, when I heard it again, the laughter. Only this time, it was closer, more distinct. The kids were back. I pulled out my phone and called my dad to ask what he thought I should do. He said if I saw them, I should chase them off, scare them if I had to, just so they wouldn't mess with our things. Figuring he was right, I aimed my rifle up and fired a warning shot. The forest went dead silent. I thought that would be the end of it, and I'd finally be able to focus on the hunt. But a wave of unease settled over me. That night, I wasn't feeling well. A headache had crept in, a dull pounding that grew worse as the hours wore on. I went to bed early, hoping some sleep would help. I left the windows open to get some fresh air, to let the cool breeze circulate, and maybe ease the throbbing in my head. Then, right around midnight, I heard it again, laughter. It drifted in through the open windows, faint at first, then louder, rising and falling like it was moving in circles around the cabin. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to listen. This time, it wasn't just laughter. There were footsteps, shuffling in the grass. I felt a cold chill creep down my spine. I got out of bed, grabbed my rifle and a flashlight from the closet, and went to the window. I peered out into the darkness, the weak beam of my flashlight barely piercing the pitch-black night. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence. Then, the laughter hit me full force, coming from what felt like only 20 yards away. I yelled out, "Get off my land!" My voice echoed through the trees, but the laughter didn't stop. It only got louder, more manic, like the sound of kids in a fit of uncontrollable giggles. I took a step toward the forest, feeling my pulse hammering in my ears. That's when I saw something land on the ground a few feet away. It looked like an old, beat-up speaker. The laughter was blaring out of it, amplified, distorted, almost mocking. Furious, I picked it up and threw it back into the woods. Then, in the dim glow of my flashlight, I thought I saw something, just for a second, a figure at the edge of my light's reach, standing still, watching. Adrenaline spiked through me, and I fired a shot into the air, shouting, "Come any closer, and I swear, I'll put a bullet in you!" The laughter finally stopped, plunging the forest into an eerie silence. I ran back into the house, locking the door behind me. I closed every curtain, shutting out the night, and sat by the door, clutching my rifle, waiting for any sign of movement. For a long while, there was nothing. I almost started to relax when I heard it, a soft, wet smudge on the living room window. I froze, every muscle tense, listening, barely breathing. After a few minutes, I finally worked up the nerve to peel back the edge of the curtain. There, smeared across the glass in what looked like blood, was a message, written in jagged letters. I couldn't bring myself to read it, not then. All I knew was that it was time to go. I packed my bag in record time, slinging my rifle over my shoulder as I headed for the door. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to punch in the lock code. Finally, it clicked, and I bolted for the truck, locking the doors and starting the engine before the seatbelt was even buckled. The whole drive back, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen, that message on the window, those twisted, laughing voices in the dark. I called my dad, told him everything, and he agreed that I was right to leave. "Nothing in that cabin is worth your life," he said. The next day, he drove up to the cabin. I met him there, staying back as he went inside. The window was clean. The blood was gone, and the house looked as if no one had ever been there. There was no sign of the speaker, no footprints, nothing. We stayed a couple of days to check everything out, but I felt a creeping dread every time night fell. It was as if the forest was watching, waiting. I haven't been back there alone since that night. There's no real explanation for what happened, and to this day, I don't know if what I saw was real, if the blood on the window was animal blood or something else entirely. All I know is that I'll never forget that sound, the laughter, echoing through the trees, as if the forest itself was mocking me. It was a Friday night, just another evening when my parents were out for the weekend. They told me to stay in, but 14 years old and the whole house to yourself? That's practically begging for a little freedom. My friend Alex had invited me out. Just a quick hangout, nothing crazy, a few games, pizza, and talking trash about our teachers. But we lost track of time, as usual. By the time I checked my phone, it was well past midnight. I texted my parents that I was back at the house, threw on my hoodie, and set out. Alex didn't live too far, just a 10-minute walk from my place. The streets were empty, and the cool October air had a bite to it that made me pick up the pace. I liked the eerie silence. It was that time of night when the world seems frozen, and your footsteps echo in ways that make you think twice about every shadow. Then I noticed the car. It was subtle at first, just a low hum in the distance, headlights catching up behind me. I didn't think much of it until I realized it was moving at my pace, keeping its distance just far enough to avoid suspicion. I stopped once, pretending to tie my shoe. The car paused, then slowly crawled forward, passing me only to pull over a few feet up the road. Probably just someone looking for an address, I told myself. But I could feel the first hints of dread creeping in. I kept walking, but now my heart was pounding. My house was only a few blocks away, but that walk stretched on forever. The car moved again, keeping its distance but shadowing me, and every so often, the headlights flashed, illuminating the street and sending cold jolts down my spine. I resisted the urge to break into a run. I didn't want whoever was behind the wheel to know they were getting to me. I clenched my fists, eyes fixed on my house, feeling the weight of the empty streets pressing down on me. When I finally made it to my driveway, I dared a quick glance over my shoulder. The car was still there, parked just a few houses down. I hurried inside, locked the door, and dropped my bag on the floor. Part of me thought about calling my parents, but I didn't want them to freak out and cut my weekend freedom short. Instead, I double-checked the locks, closed all the curtains, and tried to shake off the tension. It was probably just some creep trying to mess with me, I thought. Or maybe someone was lost and thought I was acting suspicious. I had barely settled into bed when there was a loud knock at the door. It echoed through the empty house, each knock louder than the last. My stomach dropped. I slipped out of bed, moved quietly to the window, and peeked through the curtain. The car was parked directly outside my house now, and a man was standing at my door. He looked ordinary enough, dressed in a dark jacket, cap pulled low over his face. But something was wrong. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his body tense, as if he was being hunted. "Hey! Let me in!" he called, his voice muffled through the door. "It's important! You're in danger!" My instinct screamed at me to ignore him. I took a step back from the door, my eyes locked on the figure through the peephole. He didn't look like a typical intruder. There was desperation in his eyes, like he genuinely believed he was helping. Still, I wasn't going to open the door to a stranger in the middle of the night. "Please, kid! You don't understand. Someone else is in there." The words hit me like ice. I felt every hair on my body stand up. Was he serious, or was this some twisted trick? I took a step back, and my mind raced through every horror movie I'd ever seen, every ghost story I'd ever heard. But this wasn't a movie. This was happening in my house. My breathing quickened. I backed away, turned, and bolted up the stairs to my parents' room, grabbing my phone along the way. The man continued to pound on the door, shouting something about being followed and seeing someone slip inside through the back. I didn't stay to listen. I locked myself in my parents' room, heart hammering in my chest, and dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm and steady, but I could barely hear her over the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. "Someone's outside. They said someone else is in the house." My words tumbled over each other, barely making sense. I pressed myself against the door, straining to listen. And that's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from downstairs. I clamped a hand over my mouth, holding back a gasp. The footsteps grew louder, closer, echoing up the stairway like something out of a nightmare. I thought I'd locked every door, every window, but somehow, someone was inside. I could hear the soft creak of the floorboards, the faint rustle of movement. It was real. The knocking at the front door had stopped. I could only assume the stranger had heard the footsteps too. But now there was silence, a tense, suffocating silence that filled the house. And then, suddenly, a loud bang, as if something had hit the wall outside the room I was hiding in. "Kid!" The stranger's voice sounded again, this time more frantic, coming from somewhere outside. "I swear I saw someone go in through the back. Just hang on, the cops are on their way." I wanted to believe him, but my mind was too clouded with fear and panic. I crouched down, hiding myself in the corner of the room, clutching my phone like a lifeline, barely breathing as I listened to the shuffling footsteps just outside the door. And then, the doorknob rattled. My blood ran cold. Whoever was on the other side was trying to get in. I could hear the faint click of metal, the scrape of something against the lock. as if they were trying to force their way through. I squeezed my eyes shut, heart thudding so loudly I was sure they'd hear it. Then, as quickly as it had started, the rattling stopped. Silence fell again, thick and oppressive. I opened my eyes, straining to hear any sound, any hint of movement. But all was still. I began to wonder if they'd left, if maybe the stranger outside had scared them off. Just then, flashing red and blue lights filled the room, casting eerie shadows across the walls. I let out a shuddering breath, relief flooding over me. The cops were here. I was safe. The officers burst in, moving through the house, voices low but firm, clearing each room one by one. After what felt like an eternity, they came to my parents' bedroom, their expressions a mixture of relief and concern. I stumbled out, dazed, still clutching my phone. The stranger was standing outside, talking to the officers. He looked shaken but relieved, explaining how he'd seen someone trailing me, lurking in the shadows, and how he'd tried to warn me. One of the officers walked over, his face grave. "We found a broken window in the back. Looks like someone forced their way in, but nothing's missing. It's likely they weren't here for anything in the house." The weight of his words settled over me like a dark cloud. They hadn't been after things, they'd been after me. The stranger's story, the broken window, everything lined up in a way that made my stomach twist. The reality of how close I'd come to something unthinkable sank in. The officers took me to a friend's house for the night, staying with me until my parents rushed back home the next morning. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching, waiting. The image of that dark silhouette, lurking in the house, still haunted my dreams for weeks. I still get chills when I think about that night in the warehouse. It happened 2 years ago, but sometimes it feels like it was just yesterday. I've told this story to a few friends, but most of them think I'm just making it up. Hell, sometimes I wish I were. Maybe if I tell it one more time, it'll stop haunting me. So here it goes. I was 27, working as an event organizer for a small but ambitious music promotion company. We didn't have a permanent venue, so we'd rent out different spaces around town, abandoned buildings, basements, industrial spaces, you name it. We were good at finding places that had the right vibe for the party scene, a little grunge, a little mystery. We wanted the kind of places where people would feel like anything could happen. That Friday, we booked this huge old warehouse on the outskirts of town for a 2-night event. It was a little sketchy, dusty concrete floors, some cracked windows, and God knows what stains on the walls. But it had a raw, gritty appeal. Plus, it was cheap, which was crucial because we had a tight budget. I remember thinking that it was a steal for the size. My friend Eli was helping me set things up. We'd done this kind of thing together dozens of times, so we had our routine. But the moment we walked into that warehouse, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was this strange heaviness in the air. Eli joked that it smelled like ghosts, but in his nervous laugh, I could tell he was trying to shake off the same feeling. Around midday, we ran into a problem with the power. Half of the warehouse was up and running, but the other half was pitch black. Not a single bulb would light up. We tried everything, swapping bulbs, checking the cables, jiggling switches, but nothing worked. I called up the landlord, a man named Russ. His voice had this weird calmness as he told us there was a breaker panel down in the basement, and that if we flipped the switch, it should take care of the problem. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was just eager to get the place ready before guests started showing up. Eli and I made our way to the basement, joking about descending into the depths of hell. As we went down the creaky staircase, the air grew colder with each step, and the smell, damp, stale, like the place hadn't been touched in years. The basement was narrow and low-ceilinged, and it seemed to stretch on forever, like some twisted catacomb. Russ had said the panel was in the far back. So we kept going, winding around these old pillars and stacks of forgotten crates covered in dust. Finally, we saw the panel, mounted on the wall in a tiny room at the very end of the basement. Eli let out a sigh of relief, saying, "Let's get this over with." Just as he said that, though, a strange buzzing noise started up. I thought it was maybe some old pipe rattling, but it was different. Almost like a hum, but sharper. As we stepped into the room with the breaker panel, I noticed a small red light in the far corner of the ceiling, flickering faintly. It pulsed in sync with the buzzing noise. "Security system," I muttered, assuming that explained it. But as I looked closer, something about that light seemed wrong, like it wasn't just a malfunctioning sensor. I don't know how to describe it, but it felt alive. Eli looked at me, eyebrows raised, clearly sensing something weird too. "Hey, maybe we should call Russ again. Let him know this thing's busted," Eli suggested, trying to sound casual. I pulled out my phone and dialed, explaining the noise and the flickering light. Russ didn't seem bothered. He just told us it was an old security sensor and that it would occasionally act up. The buzzing, he said, was just a side effect of the sensor wearing out. He sounded so calm that I felt like I was overreacting, so I just nodded, even though he couldn't see me, and hung up. But that's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beyond the edge of the red light, something moved. It was subtle, like a shadow shifting, but then it took form. I could see a figure hunched in the darkness, crouched low. A mess of tangled hair framed a face, and even though the lighting was dim, I could make out its wide, unblinking eyes, almost glistening in the dark. The face was turned toward me, and there was a faint grin. Or maybe it was a grimace, I couldn't tell. My heart stopped. I felt like a rabbit frozen in the gaze of a predator, unsure if it had seen me or if I could still get away. "Eli," I whispered, barely able to find my voice. He was flipping switches on the panel, not noticing the figure, and when he looked at me, I couldn't even explain. We need to go." "What?" he asked, clearly confused. I pointed, and as his eyes adjusted, he saw it too. He went pale, the color draining from his face as he realized we weren't alone. Then the figure, it waved. It didn't move forward, didn't stand up, just raised a hand in a slow, taunting wave, as if inviting us to come closer. Its fingers curled and uncurled, beckoning. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears, and every muscle in my body screamed to run, but it was like I was paralyzed. Eli grabbed my arm, yanking me back to reality, and we bolted. We didn't look back, just stumbled up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind us. We made it outside, gasping for breath. I could barely dial Russ's number with my shaking hands, but when he picked up, I was hysterical, demanding to know who the hell was in the basement. Russ was quiet for a moment, then said in that same unnervingly calm voice, "There's no one else down there. You two are the only ones with access." I almost screamed. "Don't lie to me, Russ. There was someone, no, something, down there. Sitting in the corner, watching us. Don't you dare tell me it was nothing." Russ's voice didn't waver. "You're imagining things," he said. "You're just stressed. It's an old building. Sounds can play tricks." "No," I spat, feeling an anger surge through my fear. "I know what I saw." I expected him to argue, but he just sighed and muttered something like, "This isn't the first time," before trailing off. That was it. I'd had enough. I told him we weren't going to use the warehouse for the event, and that I'd be sending someone for the deposit refund. Then I hung up. Eli and I threw our stuff in the back of the van, barely talking, just working as fast as we could. As we drove away, neither of us spoke. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing in the street, watching us go. I never went back to that warehouse. I don't even like driving through that part of town anymore. To this day, I don't know what we saw down there. Maybe some drifter hiding out, maybe something else. I've looked up the building's history, tried to see if anyone else had strange experiences there, but I haven't found anything. All I know is that the memory still haunts me. It was a chilly Saturday afternoon, and I decided to take Max, my golden retriever, for a walk at a nature reserve just outside town. This was something we did pretty often, These walks were a way for me to clear my head and let Max burn off some energy. The forest was quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves or birdsong breaking the silence. The kind of place that made you feel like you were the only person left in the world. As we walked, I felt an odd tension in the air. The trail was nearly empty, as though everyone else had decided to avoid it that day. Max was his usual playful self, bouncing around and sniffing at every blade of grass. After a while, we arrived at a small clearing with a few picnic tables and benches, and I decided it was a good spot to rest. Max, however, seemed uneasy. His ears perked up, and he stared intently into the forest beyond the clearing. At first, I thought he'd seen a squirrel or another animal, but then he began to growl, a low, rumbling sound I'd never heard from him before. I tried to calm him down, patting his back and assuring him it was probably nothing, but he wouldn't stop. His attention was fixed on something hidden among the trees. Then I saw him. A man stepped out from behind a tree, just at the edge of the clearing. He looked out of place. He wore a brown coat, heavy and thick as if he were preparing for winter, even though it was only early fall. His hair was messy, and he had a scraggly beard that didn't seem to have been trimmed in weeks. But it was his eyes that unsettled me the most, intense and focused, staring directly at me and Max as though we were the only things he could see. Max's growling intensified. He bared his teeth, which he almost never did, especially toward people. The man noticed this and took a step back, but he didn't leave. He just stood there, watching us, his face unreadable. I tried to pull Max away, coaxing him to leave, but he resisted, keeping his gaze locked on the stranger. I called out, "Hey, do you need something?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if he were studying me. Then, without a word, he took a slow step forward. Max lunged, barking ferociously, and I had to pull him back with all my strength. It was enough to snap me out of the strange paralysis I felt, and I turned us both around, walking briskly away from the clearing. My heart was pounding as we headed back toward the entrance of the park. But as we moved, I could sense him behind us. I glanced over my shoulder, and sure enough, he was following us. He kept a little distance, not close enough to confront us directly, but close enough that I could hear the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. I tightened my grip on Max's leash, whispering to him to stay calm, though I was anything but calm myself. Every instinct told me to run, but I didn't want to provoke him. As we walked, I kept trying to lose him. I took random turns, leading us off the main path, hoping he'd eventually get bored or lose interest. But he didn't. No matter which direction we went, he followed. The trees seemed to close in around us, their shadows stretching across the path, adding to the already eerie feeling that settled in my chest. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned back and shouted, "What do you want? Why are you following us?" For a moment, he stopped. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, he spoke, his voice low and rough, barely above a whisper. "Did you see me?" His words sent a chill down my spine. See him? See him doing what? I had no idea what he was talking about, and frankly, I didn't want to know. Without another word, I turned and began to run, Max sprinting beside me. I could hear the man's footsteps picking up behind us, faster, as if he was trying to catch up. My lungs burned, and my heart pounded as we bolted toward the parking lot. Finally, we reached my car, and I shoved Max inside before jumping in and locking the doors. I looked out the window, scanning the edge of the parking lot. He was nowhere in sight. But I didn't wait to see if he'd reappear. I started the engine and drove home, my hands trembling on the steering wheel the entire way. Once we got home, I tried to put the whole experience out of my mind. I told myself it was just some weirdo, probably harmless. But Max wouldn't settle. He kept pacing back and forth by the window, growling softly every time he looked out. I tried to reassure him, petting him and telling him it was all over, but he wasn't having it. Later that evening, as I was sitting in the living room, trying to read a book, I heard something, a faint sound outside the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. It was a voice, quiet but distinct, and it was calling my name. "Did you see me?" My blood ran cold. I turned off the lights, hoping that if he couldn't see me, he'd go away. I sat there in the darkness, holding Max close as he growled softly, both of us frozen, listening. The voice spoke again, a little louder this time. "Did you see me, in the woods?" I tried to call the police, whispering into the phone as I explained what was happening. They assured me they'd send someone to check around, and I hung up, feeling slightly more at ease. But by the time they arrived, there was no sign of him. They looked around the house and assured me everything was clear. They even offered to patrol the area for a few days, just to be safe. That night I barely slept. Every little noise made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. When morning finally came, I felt a strange sense of relief, as though daylight could somehow protect me. The man never returned, at least not that I could see. But the memory of that question, "Did you see me?" stayed with me, haunting my thoughts. I couldn't help but wonder what he'd been doing in those woods, what he hadn't wanted anyone to witness. Part of me wanted to know, but another part was terrified of the answer. It was a warm summer night in 2010, a night like any other. I'd taken my dog, Rufus, out for his nightly walk, following the same familiar path I'd always taken. Rufus was a big, sturdy dog, the type you could trust to be by your side no matter what. He was used to our routine, same route, same pace, same turns, but sometimes I'd take a different street just for a change of scenery. That night, though, I decided to go down a street that I'd only driven past a few times but never actually walked. There was a house there on the corner, a place I'd heard about but never paid much attention to. Locals called it the House of Shadows, though I'd only heard whispers of its story. There was something about a young woman who'd died there, a possible crime, and an old boyfriend who'd vanished. Just rumors, but there was something about that house that unsettled people. From what I knew, it had been empty for years, a haunting presence among the otherwise well-kept homes on that street. The town had even tried to sell it, I heard, but no one was willing to move in, not even contractors who usually snapped up old places. I'd driven past it before, sure, but seeing it on foot was different. I hadn't expected it to stand out so dramatically in person, like a scar among the neighborhood's otherwise neat homes. As we got closer, Rufus stopped before I even thought to. His ears perked up, and he stared straight at the house, his head tilting slightly as if he was listening to something. I paused, scanning the neighborhood. It was quiet, only the distant hum of the occasional car passing on the main road. The house was shrouded in darkness, conveniently nestled between two street lamps, making it almost invisible in the night. Thick bushes lined the property, creating a shadowy barrier between it and the rest of the street. There was a strange pull, a curiosity that nudged me to walk closer, to get a better look. I took a step onto the overgrown grass, and Rufus let out a low, uneasy growl. He didn't want to follow me. He kept his distance, casting anxious glances back at the street as if he'd rather be anywhere else. I gave him a gentle tug, but he hesitated. Finally, he reluctantly followed, his ears still flattened, his gaze fixed on the house as we moved onto the property. The house itself was weathered and warped by time. I noticed an open window on the front side, which surprised me. Who would leave a window open in an abandoned house like this? I walked toward it, almost feeling the air shift as I approached. Rufus's low growl continued, but he stayed close, his body tense beside me. I pressed my face to the screen, peering inside. The interior was shadowy but not completely dark. I could see the faint outline of a living room, empty and desolate. My eyes scanned the room, landing on the back wall where there was an opening that seemed to lead into another room. I squinted, straining to make out anything, but all I saw was an emptiness that seemed to stretch on. Then I heard it, a sound from somewhere inside, a dull thud echoing through the quiet. It sounded like something heavy dropping onto a wooden floor. The sound sent a jolt through me, making my heart race. I thought about leaving, but a strange surge of curiosity kept me there. I reasoned that I had Rufus with me, and the thought gave me a bit of courage. I decided to move toward the backyard, around the side of the house. The backyard was massive, bordered by thick trees and tangled brush, giving it an almost wild, forgotten feeling. The grass was long and unkempt, the kind that would swallow your ankles if you weren't careful. In one corner stood an old shed, its door ajar, creaking slightly in the faint breeze. It looked as neglected as the house itself, worn, dark, and ominous. Rufus had stopped growling by this point, but his silence was unnerving. He was usually a loud dog, bark happy and energetic, yet here he was silent, his gaze locked on the shed, almost as if he knew something I didn't. I tugged him gently, motioning for him to follow me toward the shed. He was hesitant, his steps careful, his nose twitching at the scent of the place. The door to the shed was slightly open, just enough for me to peer inside. I took a deep breath and looked in. At first, all I could see was darkness, an empty void where the interior should have been. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized the shed wasn't entirely empty. Standing there, in the middle of the dusty, cobweb-filled space, was a figure. It was a girl, or at least, she looked like one. Thin, with pale skin and long, tangled hair that fell over her face, hiding her eyes. She was facing away from me, her head slightly tilted as though she was listening for something. She stood there, perfectly still, her arms hanging limply at her sides. Rufus started barking, loud, frantic, desperate. His barks cut through the silence, harsh and jarring, like he was trying to warn me. His paws scrabbled at the dirt, pulling hard on his leash, trying to get away. My heart pounded as I took a step back, still staring at the figure in the shed. Then, slowly, the girl turned. Her movements were unnaturally slow, like she was moving underwater. As her face came into view, I felt a chill race down my spine. Her skin was pale and lifeless, her eyes dark and hollow, as if they'd been drained of light. She looked right at me, her gaze piercing and unsettling, and in that instant, I knew she wasn't right. There was something about her, something beyond the normal explanations of logic and reason. I didn't wait to find out what she wanted or why she was there. I turned and ran, my grip tight on Rufus's leash as he bolted alongside me. We didn't stop running until we were far from the house, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart racing. I glanced back only once, but the house was shrouded in darkness, and the figure was nowhere in sight. That night stayed with me for years. I'd like to think it was just some girl who'd snuck in for her own reasons, or maybe some strange illusion brought on by the eerie setting and the darkness. But there was something about her eyes, that hollow stare, that didn't feel human. After that, I never walked down that street again.